She thought she needed stability, but what she found was something more intense, not destructive, just real. And somehow, it became the only warmth she wanted. We are about to hear this story right now. The lift doors closed with a sound like a held breath finally released. Hermione stood alone inside the descending box of polished wood and enchanted brass, watching the floor numbers tick downward, and allowed herself exactly 4 seconds of stillness. 4 seconds in which her face could do whatever it needed to do. Crumple, tighten, go dangerously blank, before she would smooth it back into something presentable and walk out into level 2, like a woman who had slept and eaten and had not spent the previous night sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the cold oven door. 1. The ring was still in the small ceramic dish on the bathroom shelf. She had not moved it. She wasn't sure what moving it would mean, whether it would feel like release or erasure. And she had found in the 4 days since Ron had stood in their hallway with his hands in his jacket pockets and said the words she had been pretending not to hear building for months. She had found she could not make decisions about small things. She could make large ones. She had come to work. She had drafted 2 policy amendments and attended a departmental review and answered 43 internal memos. She had done all of it with the mechanical competence of someone who had learned very early that work was the one place the world made consistent sense. 2. He had not been cruel. That was the part that kept snagging in her, a loose thread she couldn't stop pulling. He had been tired and honest and sad in a way that told her he had been sad for longer than she'd known. And there was something almost worse about that, about learning that a person had been quietly grieving something while standing right beside you, and you had not seen it because you were also, in your own way, looking elsewhere. They had loved each other. She still believed that. She simply was no longer certain that love by itself was architecture, that it could hold the weight of 2 people who had grown into shapes that no longer fit the same space. 3. Harry knew. She had told him in 3 sentences, and then asked him firmly not to be kind about it yet, because kindness would undo something she needed to keep fastened. He had respected that with the particular grace he reserved for moments that required it, which was one of the reasons she had loved him since she was 12 years old. Ginny had sent a brief note that said, "Only, I'm here when you're ready, and nothing else," and that had been, in its restrained precision, almost more than Hermione could bear. No one at the ministry knew. She intended to keep it that way. 4. The lift arrived. She straightened her spine, tucked a curl behind her ear, and walked out into the corridor of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement with her satchel over her shoulder and her expression calibrated to purposeful and unapproachable, which was, in fairness, not significantly different from her ordinary expression. The department in the early morning had a particular quality she had always appreciated, a kind of suspended industriousness, the hum of enchanted quills warming up, the smell of fresh parchment, and something faintly metallic that she had decided years ago was simply what ambition smelled like when enough of it occupied the same space. Witches and wizards moved through the corridors with the focused energy of people who believed, at least before lunch, that what they were doing mattered. Hermione believed it too. That was not performance. She passed the cluster of cubicles that housed the Aura Support Division, nodded to Williamson, who lifted his coffee in acknowledgement without looking up, and turned the corner toward the Policy and Reform Office that she had occupied for the past 3 years. It was not a large office. It had one window that looked out onto an enchanted view of Edinburgh in permanent autumn, which she had chosen herself, and which Ron had once said was depressing. She had told him it was atmospheric. They had laughed. She did not think about that. She set her satchel down on her desk, arranged her files by urgency, and uncapped her quill. She had been writing for perhaps 20 minutes when the door opened without a knock. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, a reliable daily feature of her professional life, as reliable as the Morning Post and the faint smell of old books that emanated from the archive corridor. She knew who it was before she looked up, recognized the particular quality of the footstep. Unhurried, deliberate, the footstep of a man who had decided long ago that the world would wait for him and had found the world, to its own irritation, largely agreed. Granger. Malfoy. She did not look up. Whatever it is, it's early. She heard him move into the room, not to her desk, but to the standing bookcase beside the window, which he sometimes used as though it were a library he personally maintained. She had long since stopped objecting. It had proved less exhausting than continuing to object. The Thornfield Amendment. What about it? The sub-clause on retrospective application is going to be challenged. I've had the legal team look at it and they agree with me. Now she looked up. Draco Malfoy was standing with one hand resting against the bookcase, not quite leaning, reading the spine of a text on wizarding property law with the mild interest of a man who found most things mildly interesting and very few things actually worth his sustained attention. He had the angular, composed quality he always carried, a kind of deliberate stillness that she had spent years interpreting as arrogance and had more recently, grudgingly, revised to something more complicated than that. He was in ministry charcoal, which suited him in the way that severe things generally suited severe people. His hair was the colour of winter light. He had worked at the ministry for 4 years. He had been in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 2, transferred from the International Cooperation Division with a reputation that preceded him in 3 distinct categories: exceptionally competent, professionally difficult, and carrying a past that roughly half the department felt should disqualify him from public service, and the other half had decided to evaluate on current evidence. Hermione was in the second half. This had not made things simple. "Your legal team," she said, "has the analytical range of a first-year charms essay. They passed their bar qualifications. I'm delighted for them." She set down her quill. The retrospective clause is the entire structural argument of the amendment. Without it, the reform only applies to new cases, which means the 147 outstanding cases that the amendment was specifically designed to address continue to be processed under the old guidelines, which are, as I have explained to you and to your legal team, and apparently to the wider universe, without adequate penetration. "Inadequate," Draco said, still reading the spine. "Yes, you've mentioned." "Then why are we having this conversation again?" He turned then. not quickly. He did most things without urgency, which he found alternatively admirable and maddening, and looked at her with that particular grey gaze that had stopped at some point in the past 2 years, feeling like a challenge, and started feeling like something more unsettling than that. Assessment, perhaps. The sense of being actually seen rather than simply opposed. Because, he said, the challenge isn't about whether the clause is good. It's about whether it will survive the Wizengamot review in its current form. And I am telling you, not arguing with you about policy merit, telling you as a matter of procedural reality, that it won't. Hermione was quiet for a moment. This was the difficult thing about Malfoy, the thing that had taken her years to properly account for. He was not, when it came to the actual substance of the work, wrong very often. He was wrong about people sometimes. He was wrong in his instinctive assumptions about how the world should be ordered, had been deeply, catastrophically wrong about that for a significant portion of his life, and carried that wrongness with him in a way she had come to recognize not as arrogance, but as something more internal and less resoluble. But on matters of legal mechanics and institutional strategy, he had a precision that was, when she was being entirely honest with herself, as close to her own as anyone she had professionally encountered. She hated that. She had decided she was allowed to hate it. If the retrospective clause is vulnerable, she said carefully, I need to know specifically where so I can fortify the language, not remove the provision. Something shifted in his expression. Small. It was always small with him. He rationed legibility the way some people rationed expensive things, carefully, aware of the cost of excess. But it was there. I know, he said. Then sit down and tell me. He didn't sit. He moved to the chair across from her desk and stood behind it with both hands resting on the back, which was his version of compromise, a posture that acknowledged the invitation without fully accepting it, kept him at a distance he could control. She had catalogued all his distances by now. She had done it without intending to. The language in paragraph 7 implies a mandate for retroactive aura review, he said. The Wizengamot will argue that creates an unacceptable workload burden and use that as grounds to send it back to committee, which will take 8 months minimum. Her jaw tightened, which is deliberate. Obviously, it's deliberate. His voice was dry. Most obstacles are. She reached for her copy of the amendment and turned to paragraph 7. He was right. She could see it immediately, the slight overreach in her own wording, the place where her certainty about what the law should do had outpaced her calculation of what it could survive. She disliked this feeling, the specific texture of a mistake in her own work, familiar and still sharp every time. She picked up her quill. For a while, the only sounds were the scratch of her writing and the quiet, ambient noise of the department finding its morning rhythm outside the door. Draco remained where he was, not looking at her with any particular intensity, not filling the silence with anything, simply present in the way he sometimes was when they were working, occupying the same space without demanding anything from it. It was almost, in its way, peaceful. She did not register the exact moment it happened, only that she had been writing, and then her hand had stopped moving, and she was looking at paragraph 9 without reading it, and she was thinking about the kitchen floor and the cold of the oven door against her back, and the way the ring had caught the light as she set it in the ceramic dish. She was not going to cry. She was not going to cry in her office at 8:40 in the morning in front of Draco Malfoy. She pressed the end of her quill against her fingertip, concentrated on the sensation, anchored herself to it. Granger. His voice was different, not softer. Draco Malfoy did not do soft exactly, but stripped of its usual precise edge, the professional quality gone, replaced by something more direct that she couldn't immediately categorize. She looked up. He was watching her, not with analysis, not with the grey strategic attention he usually aimed at things, with something plainer than that, something that asked no questions and made no interpretations and simply acknowledged. She did not know how long he had been watching. She did not know what her face had done while she was thinking about ceramic dishes and late-night kitchen floors. She found, which was unusual and slightly alarming, that she could not immediately reconstruct her expression into something manageable. Her face appeared to have decided, without her consultation, to simply be what it was. "The Thornfield clause," he said after a moment. "It'll hold, with a revision." He was, she understood, offering her the re-anchor, the professional surface, the firm ground of work that he had, for some reason she did not examine, intuited she needed. She took it. "Yes," she said, "I think it will." He nodded once, pushed back from the chair. At the door he paused, not quite looking back, his profile to her, the winter-light hair the set of his jaw. "The Edinburgh view," he said. "It's better in the morning." Then he was gone, and the door was closed, and Hermione sat alone in her office with her quill in her hand, and the faint, unsettling awareness that Draco Malfoy had just, without ceremony or apparent effort, been the kindest person she'd spoken to in 4 days. She looked at the window. The enchanted Edinburgh sky was the particular gold of early morning, light moving across old stone, a city being quietly, faithfully itself. She pressed her quill to the parchment and kept working. But her hand, she noticed, had stopped shaking. The thing about anger was that it had weight. Hermione had learned this early, not the childish flair of it, the hot, bright thing that passed quickly and left embarrassment in its wake, but the other kind. The kind that settled in the chest like ballast, that made you heavier and therefore harder to move. She had spent most of her adult life treating anger as a tool rather than an indulgence, something to be directed with precision rather than spilled carelessly across the people nearest to her. This week, she was grateful for it. It was easier, she had discovered, to be angry at Malfoy than to be anything else. Anger had clear edges. Anger gave her somewhere to put her hands. The conflict this particular Thursday concerned the reclassification proposal, a 17-page document she had spent 3 weeks constructing, which outlined a new framework for reviewing the magical creature protection statutes that had gone essentially unchanged since 1947. It was careful work. It was thorough, cross-referenced, and built on 18 months of case evidence she had assembled herself, often at hours that her body had quietly protested. She was proud of it in the way she was proud of most things she made, not with vanity, but with the steady knowledge of effort honestly spent. Malfoy had returned it to her desk that morning with a single sheet of notes attached. The notes were accurate. This was the problem. They identified 4 genuine structural vulnerabilities, 2 places where her legal citations required updating, and 1 paragraph that she could now see, with the sick clarity of hindsight, she would need to substantially rewrite. All of this was correct. All of this was useful. All of this had arrived in his handwriting, small, precise, slightly angular, without a single word of preamble or acknowledgement, as though he had simply reached into her work and rearranged it and expected her to be grateful. She was not grateful. She was incandescent. She found him at 11 o'clock in the 3rd floor conference room, where the senior interdepartmental staff gathered twice weekly for what was officially called a strategy review, and functionally operated as an exercise in institutional theatre. 12 people around an oval table, most of them performing attentiveness to a presentation on cross-departmental resource allocation. Malfoy was at the far end, half-turned in his chair with his forearm resting on the table, not quite watching the presentation, not quite watching anything, wearing the expression she had privately catalogued as his waiting for something worth thinking about face. She sat down across from him, set her copy of his notes on the table between them, and said very quietly, "We need to discuss this." He glanced at the notes, then at her. "Now? After?" A pause. "Unless you'd like to explain to the room why you've redlined the central argument of my proposal." "I didn't redline your argument. I flagged your methodology. Those are the same thing." "They are, emphatically, not the same thing." Somebody at the head of the table said something about quarterly projections. Hermione maintained eye contact with Malfoy with the focused intensity of a woman who had once held a partial basilisk gaze and was therefore not easily stared down. He held it with the mild composure of someone who had long since decided that other people's intensity was, in general, their own problem. After the meeting, she followed him into the corridor. "You had 3 weeks to raise these concerns," she said, keeping her voice level and clipped. "The proposal goes to the Wizengamot subcommittee in 8 days. 8 days, Malfoy. I was made aware of it 6 days ago." He turned to face her, unhurried. "Williamson only forwarded it to our division last Friday." This gave her a brief, uncomfortable pause. She had sent the proposal to Williamson 3 weeks ago, with a clear note requesting interdepartmental review. If he had sat on it for 2 weeks before circulating it, which was, she was aware, entirely consistent with Williamson's relationship to administrative process, then Malfoy's timeline was accurate, and her anger required a partial redirect. She did not redirect it. Not entirely. She was not, this week, particularly interested in being fair. "The citations on page 11 are fine," she said. "They cite a ruling that was partially overturned in 2009. Partially. The relevant section stands." "The relevant section is in the part that stands, yes." He folded his arms across his chest, and she registered, not for the first time, how he used his own stillness as a kind of argument. The deliberate lack of agitation that implied he was the reasonable party in any given exchange by simple contrast. It was an infuriating technique, and she was privately certain he had calculated it. But the Wizengamot will see the 2009 reference and question the whole foundation before anyone reads far enough to realize the distinction. Then, I'll add a footnote clarifying the partial nature of the overturning. Or you could update to the 2011 Fairweather ruling, which supersedes both and is unambiguous. A silence. She knew the Fairweather ruling. She had not, she now acknowledged internally and exclusively, considered it in this context. She had been working on the proposal in the evenings largely, sitting at the kitchen table that was now just her kitchen table, with the ring in the ceramic dish in the bathroom that she still had not moved, and some of her usual meticulous attention to precedent had apparently slipped. "Fine," she said. The word came out harder than she intended. "I'll update the citation." "Granger!" "I'll update it, Malfoy. That's all that needs to happen." I wasn't criticizing the proposal. His voice had shifted again, that slight flattening she'd noticed before. Not gentleness, precisely. Something more careful than gentleness. The way you might move near something you suspected was fragile without acknowledging that you suspected it. It's good work. It's the best reclassification framework this department has seen in 15 years, and I've read the others. I'm flagging the mechanics because the mechanics will be used against it if we don't address them first. We. The word sat between them, brief and strange. She looked at him. He was watching her with that undecorated directness, not performing patience, simply being still in the way that she had spent years cataloguing as arrogance and kept finding, when she reached the end of the catalogue, was something she didn't have a clean word for. He believed in the work. She could see it, buried under all the professional distance and the careful deflection of anything that might be called warmth. Underneath all the grey marble composure, he actually cared whether the thing was done correctly, not for strategic reasons, not for advancement, because the work was real and it mattered, and doing it badly was a waste. It was, she thought, not unlike her own relationship to it. She hated that too. "The paragraph on creature classification hierarchy," she said after a moment. "Your note says it needs restructuring. I want to understand exactly what you mean by that." Something in his posture shifted. Fractional, barely legible, the equivalent on his scale of visible relief. "Your current structure argues from species down to statute. The argument is stronger if you invert it. Start with the statutory failure and work back to the species impact. It makes the case for the proposal instead of explaining the proposal." Hermione was quiet. He was right. Again. The specific, precise rightness of it landed in the center of her chest and spread outward in the particular way that only occurred when someone identified not a mistake, but a missed opportunity. Something that wasn't wrong so much as not yet fully itself. "I wrote it the other way, because I wanted the reader to understand the context before the argument," she said. "Your reader is a Wizengamot subcommittee. They have the context. They want the argument." She exhaled slowly through her nose, which was as close as she intended to come to conceding the point aloud. Draco, to his credit, did not look triumphant. He looked, if anything, slightly careful, the expression of a man who was aware he had won something, and was equally aware that winning it loudly would cost him more than it was worth. They stood in the corridor in the space that followed, which was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, occupying some third quality she didn't have language for. Around them, the department continued its mid-morning movement. Memos flapping past, voices from behind closed doors, someone's enchanted filing cabinet opening and closing in a rapid, frustrated rhythm. "I'll have the revisions done by Friday," she said finally. "I know you will." She looked at him. The certainty in it was not flattery. It was simply a statement of what he expected, which was apparently excellence, delivered on time, because he appeared to have no framework in which anything else from her was plausible. She found she had no ready response to that. She picked up her copy of his notes and walked back toward her office. At the corner, she stopped, not quite turning the way she had seen him do. The partial turn, the profile, the thing that was not quite looking back. Malfoy. Granger. The fair weather ruling. "Did you look it up specifically for this, or did you already know it?" A beat. She heard rather than saw the quality of his pause, the slight compression of it that indicated a small private amusement he had decided not to fully express. Already knew it. She turned the corner. She didn't look back after that. At lunch, she sat alone in the small staff room on level 3 with a sandwich she was eating because she had decided she was going to eat, not because hunger had registered in any meaningful way. Her copy of his notes was on the table. She had been reading them again, the small, precise handwriting, the economical way he expressed an argument, the absence of any superfluous word. She thought about we. The thing was, and she was aware this required a kind of brutal self-honesty she was not today entirely in the mood for. The thing was that over the past 2 years, she had come to rely on Malfoy's opposition in a way she had not fully acknowledged. He sharpened things. When he pushed back on her work, it came back stronger. When he argued with her, she found angles she hadn't considered. When he told her something was wrong, she paid attention, not because she conceded automatically, but because she had learned, grudgingly and over considerable time, that when Draco Malfoy identified a problem, there was a problem. This was professionally inconvenient. It was also the closest thing she currently had to someone seeing her clearly. Harry was gentle with her. Ginny was giving her space. Her parents were in Australia, and she had not yet worked out how to have that conversation across an international flu connection. Her other friends operated around the fact of Ron like a bruise they were all careful not to press. The ministry colleagues who did not know treated her with the ordinary indifferent professionalism of people who have no idea a person is holding something together by deliberate force of will. Malfoy argued with her about statute citations and paragraph structure. He returned her work with precise, impersonal notes. He expected her to be excellent and did not particularly care, apparently, about anything else, which meant he was the only person in her current daily life who was interacting with her, the actual ungrieving professional her, rather than with his awareness of her grief. This was more sustaining than she would have predicted. She took a bite of her sandwich and looked out the staff room window, enchanted, this one, to display a permanent view of Scottish Highlands in early morning mist, which someone had clearly chosen with intentions toward the sublime, and which she found, today, more comforting than Edinburgh's autumn gold. Her hand went to her left hand. The absent weight of it, the slight indentation still faintly present, the ghost of something that had been there for 2 years. She pressed her thumb against it, and then, deliberately, took her hand away. She finished her sandwich. She went back to work. She rewrote the central paragraph of the reclassification proposal, the way Malfoy had described. Statute first, then species, the argument before the context. And sat back and read it, and felt the uncomfortable, clarifying rightness of it settle into the work like a key finding its lock. At the bottom of the page, she wrote a note in the margin, in her own small, neat hand. See Fairweather, 2011. She didn't thank him. He wouldn't expect it. That was, she had come to understand, one of the specific ways Draco Malfoy was actually easier than most people. He did not require the performance of gratitude. He required the evidence of it, which was different, and which he expressed in the only currency he appeared to fully value. She made the work better. She sent him the revised draft at 4:30 with no accompanying note. At 5:10, a single inter-office memo arrived at her desk, folded into a sharp, precise rectangle. Not the usual haphazard flap of standard ministry post, but something more deliberate, crisp at every edge. She opened it. Paragraph restructuring works. Fairweather citation placed correctly. M. Nothing else. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it and set it aside and reached for the next file on her desk and kept working. The thing about anger, she thought, was that it had weight. And sometimes, without your noticing, something else quietly became heavier. The rain started on a Tuesday. It arrived the way significant things sometimes did. Quietly, without announcement, a change in the quality of the air before the first drop fell. Something atmospheric tightening until it finally released. By Wednesday morning, it had settled into the particular London persistence that suggested it had no intention of leaving. A low grey ceiling pressing down on the city, the streets below the ministry's enchanted windows running dark and reflective. Hermione noticed the rain the way she noticed most things that week, distantly, through glass, as though she were watching the world from a slight remove that had nothing to do with geography. She had moved the ring, not discarded it. She was not ready for that, and she was trying to be honest with herself about what she was and wasn't ready for. Which was harder than it sounded when you were the kind of person who had spent most of your life moving faster than your own feelings. She had moved it from the ceramic dish on the bathroom shelf to the small wooden box in her bedside drawer, the one that contained her grandmother's earrings and a pressed flower from Bill and Fleur's wedding, and other things that mattered in the category of mattered once. Handle with care. It felt like the right taxonomy. Not erasure, not display. Something in between, where things could exist quietly while she worked out what to do with them. She had done this at 2 a.m, standing in the bathroom in the dark, and then she had gone back to bed and lain very still and felt the specific interior quality of a decision that couldn't be unmade, which was not grief exactly, but lived in the same neighborhood. By the time she reached the ministry on Wednesday, she had been awake for most of 20 hours. The fracture, when it came, happened over something small. This was, she would later reflect, how most real things happened. Not over the large dramatic moments that announced themselves with the courtesy of their own weight, but in the unguarded spaces between them, when the armor had been worn too long and was beginning to gap at the joints. It was late afternoon. The department had thinned. Several colleagues at an external briefing, Others drifted toward the lifts with the particular purposeful loosening of people who had decided that 4:30 was close enough to 5. Hermione was at her desk with the third draft of the Thornfield Amendment open before her, and a cooling cup of tea she had made at 2 and forgotten about. And she was working on a paragraph that was not cooperating, that kept coming out either too broad or too specific, refusing to find its proper register. She heard him before she saw him. The footstep, the particular knock that was more of a formality than a request, the slight shift of air pressure as the door opened. "Still at it," Draco said, not a question. Obviously. She didn't look up. "What do you need?" "The Thornfield subclause. I wanted to check whether you'd—" "I've drafted 3 versions. None of them are right yet." A pause. Then, to her mild surprise, he came fully into the office, rather than hovering in his usual manner near the bookcase or the door, and he set a folder on the edge of her desk. She looked at it. "Legal precedents for retrospective review clauses that survived Wizengamot Challenge," he said. "From the past 20 years. I had the archive retrieve them." She looked up at him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, a posture she recognized as his version of casual, the closest he came to appearing unguarded. And he was not looking at her with any particular significance, just looking at her in the plain, direct way he did when he had done something and was presenting it without decoration. He had spent time on this. The archive retrieval alone would have taken the better part of an hour, the selection and organization of relevant precedents longer. He had done it without being asked, and without, apparently, any intention of drawing attention to having done it. Something moved in her chest. She pressed it down. "Thank you," she said. "It's useful for the work." "I know it's useful for the work. I'm still thanking you." He made a small, dismissive sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite deflection. She opened the folder. The precedents were organized chronologically, each one annotated in his small, precise hand. A sentence or two identifying the relevant provision, the nature of the challenge, the outcome. It was meticulous. It was, in its careful thoroughness, an act of considerable professional generosity from a man who was not, in general, generous with his time. She was reading the third entry when he said, "Not sitting, not settled, just present in the way he sometimes was." "You look exhausted." Her quill stopped. The silence that followed had a specific quality. She was aware of her own stillness, the slight alteration in the room's atmosphere, the way the rain had picked up against the enchanted window so that Edinburgh in autumn was blurred to impressionism behind the water. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you look exhausted." "Those are related observations." "Not necessarily." She set down her quill. She looked at him, really looked, which she occasionally did despite herself, when her defenses were at low ebb, and she forgot to look slightly past him the way she had trained herself. He was watching her with that plain, stripped quality, no analysis in it, no strategy, just the unmediated attention of someone who had noticed something and was not pretending otherwise. "I'm sleeping poorly," she said, which was true, and revealed nothing she hadn't already communicated with the shadows beneath her eyes. He nodded, as though this was information that mattered but didn't require a response, which was, she found in that unguarded moment, almost exactly what she needed. Not "I'm sorry," or "Are you all right?" or the particular tender concern that made her want to pull away, because tenderness required her to be soft, and she was not, this week, certain she could be soft and stay intact. Just a nod. I see. That is real. I'm noting it. She looked back down at the folder. The 1998 Aldridge precedent, she said, finding her professional footing again. This is useful. The language of the surviving clause is almost directly applicable. I thought so. You could have just referenced it in a memo. You would have asked for the full context anyway. This was accurate. She almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but it came closer than anything had in several days, and she felt the muscles near her eyes do something involuntary that she hoped he hadn't noticed. He had noticed. She could tell by the way he looked briefly away, not with discomfort, but with a kind of deliberate tact, the studied gaze toward the rain-blurred window that gave her the privacy of a moment without making a ceremony of offering it. They worked for a while after that. Not in silence exactly. She asked him questions about two of the precedents. He answered with precision and occasional dry commentary on the historical judges involved. She pushed back on one of his interpretations, and he pushed back on hers, and they arrived, through the familiar friction of it, at something better than either of them had started with. It was, she noticed, sitting with the folder open and her quill moving, and the rain steady against the glass. It was the least fragmented she had felt in a week. The fracture came at 5:30. She had been reaching across her desk for a reference text when her elbow caught the ceramic mug, the forgotten cold tea, and it went over the edge, and she caught it by reflex, but not before a wave of tea-coloured water swept across the nearest stack of parchment. She said something that wasn't quite a word. Here. Draco was already moving, reaching. She had her wand out, a quick drying charm across the top sheets, and he produced a spare piece of blotting parchment from somewhere and pressed it against the lower stack. And for a moment they were both leaning over the desk in the same space, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the faint scent of something clean and faintly resinous, like cedarwood and old books, and something else she couldn't name. The parchment was salvaged. She straightened. He straightened. They were very close. The kind of close that required either acknowledgement or a managed retreat, and she was in the middle of deciding which when he reached out. Automatic, she thought, unthought. The reflex of someone who had been in the same space and seen a thing and moved toward it without deliberation, and brushed a smear of tea from the back of her hand with the edge of the blotting parchment. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. His hand was... She registered this with the startled clarity of something perceived below conscious thought. Careful. Not tentative, not clinical, just careful. The way you handled something you were aware had weight. He pulled back. She saw the moment he registered what he'd done. Not horror, nothing as legible as that, but a slight tightening, a return to controlled distance, the marble composure resettling like water finding its level. Sorry, he said. The word was clipped and automatic. It's fine. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. He picked up his folder, the archive one, his own, which he had apparently intended to retrieve while delivering hers. Professional, after all. The whole visit professional, after all. Friday, he said, meaning the revised amendment draft. Friday, she agreed. He left. The door closed with its usual soft finality, and she was alone in her office with the rain-blurred window and the cold tea smell and the absolutely ordinary professional disorder of her desk. She looked at the back of her hand. 2 seconds. Less, perhaps. The impersonal paper edge of the blotting parchment, the brief, careful pressure of it, already fading to nothing against her skin. She sat down. The thing was, and she sat with this for a long moment, with the directness she applied to things she didn't want to look at, because not looking never actually helped. The thing was that it had been the first time in 10 days that someone had touched her. Not a greeting handshake, not an accidental brush in a corridor. An intentional touch, however brief, however unconscious in its origin. Directed at her, at the specific geography of her, as though she was something worth the small, precise attention of 2 careful seconds. Ron had been. They had been. She had been held and touched and known in the way of long familiarity. And then that had ended, and she had not understood until this moment in her rain-grey office how much of herself she had been holding at arm's length from her own awareness, because the awareness was too large and she had work to do. She pressed her right hand flat against the desk. She thought about the wooden box in her bedside drawer, the ring nested among her grandmother's earrings, and a pressed flower in the category of mattered once. Handle with care. She thought about cedarwood and old books, the careful wait of 2 seconds. She picked up her quill. She did not think about it any more that evening. She was extremely deliberate about this, in the way she was deliberate about most things she had decided to be deliberate about, and she worked until the enchanted Edinburgh sky had gone to deep blue-grey dusk, and the rain had softened to a mist, and the department outside her door had gone entirely quiet. Then she gathered her things and put on her coat and walked to the lifts, and did not think in the lift descending about the particular quality of careful, did not think about it at all. The lift arrived. She walked out into the atrium with her satchel over her shoulder and her expression arranged, and her chest doing something she was choosing, firmly and with full adult deliberation, not to name. Outside, the rain was still falling. She walked into it without an umbrella and let it be cold against her face, and found that this, for the moment, was enough. There was a particular kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. Hermione had identified it first in herself at 14, sitting in the Hogwarts library with 6 books open simultaneously, and the distinct, pressing awareness that the knowledge she needed was somewhere in the stack, and she would not rest until she found it. It was not patience, and it was not obsession. It was something more precise than either, a kind of directed gravitational pull toward the thing that would resolve the incompleteness. She felt it now, on Thursday morning, walking the level 2 corridor, and she did not want to examine what it was directed toward. She had been careful since Wednesday. Carefully professional, carefully occupied, carefully surrounded by the legitimate density of her work. She had the Thornfield Amendment and the reclassification proposal, and a new briefing request that had arrived that morning from the Department of Magical Creatures, requiring her specific expertise on cross-departmental implementation. She had enough work to fill 4 people. She used it the way she used most things she was good at, as architecture, as structure, as the framework that made a self coherent when the self was otherwise under some private negotiation. She had not sought him out. She was aware of not seeking him out in the specific way that you were aware of not touching a bruise, the conscious rooting around it, the slight alteration of your usual path. It lasted until 10:30, when she needed the Aldridge precedent file back. She told herself this was entirely legitimate. The file was hers, borrowed for his reference, and she needed the third annotated entry for the subclause revision. She told herself this with the brisk internal conviction of someone who was not in any way constructing a reason. His office was at the far end of the Level 2 corridor, past the Aura Support Division and around the corner where the older section of the department occupied a stretch of rooms with higher ceilings and narrower windows, less renovated than the rest, smelling faintly of the aged stone beneath the plasterwork. His door was partially open. She knocked on the frame. He was at his desk, actually at it, which was not always the case. He had a habit of working from various surfaces throughout the department as though tethered to no particular location, which she had always found vaguely irritating in the way of things that implied an ease with the world you had not yourself achieved. He was reading something, his head slightly bent, and he looked up when she knocked with the unhurried quality of someone who had been expecting interruption, in general, if not specifically. "Granger. The Aldridge file. I need it back." He looked at her for a moment, that plain, assessing look, reading something she hadn't authorized him to read. Then he opened the top left drawer of his desk without looking away from her and produced the folder, which he set on the desk's edge. She crossed the room to take it. His office was smaller than hers, she noticed, not for the first time, but with a slightly sharper attention today. Organized with the particular precision of someone who thought spatially, who understood their own materials. No unnecessary objects. The books on his shelves were arranged not decoratively, but functionally, grouped by application rather than subject. On the corner of his desk, a small piece of malachite, dark green, smooth-edged, the size of a fist, that she had never seen elsewhere on his person or in his space, which meant it was not decorative and not functional in any obvious sense, which meant it was something else entirely. She picked up the folder. She should leave. She had the folder. The stated reason for being here was resolved. "The subclause revision," she said instead. "I've tried the Aldridge language as a model, but the syntax is creating an ambiguity in my third sentence I can't resolve." He leaned back slightly in his chair, not inviting her to stay, not dismissing her, simply recalibrating to the conversation being longer than a retrieval. "Show me," he said. She should have brought the draft. She hadn't brought the draft because she had told herself this was only a retrieval. She pulled out her wand, conjured a quick duplicate of the relevant page from memory, a trick she had developed in the years since the war when carrying every document everywhere had become impractical, and set it on his desk. He read it. She watched him read it, which she did not usually permit herself, but she was standing in his office, and there was nowhere else to look that wasn't deliberate about not looking at him, and that seemed worse. His face, while he read, was different from his face in conversation. The careful composure was still there, but lower, less performed, like a light turned down rather than off. She could see the actual movement of his thinking, the slight pull at the corner of his mouth that meant he'd found something, the still moment that meant he was passing, the brief downward flicker of his gaze that meant he was going back to check something. She had not been this close to him since Wednesday, since the desk and the blotting parchment and the 2 seconds she was not thinking about. The tooth of old parchment, her conjured duplicate, slightly imperfect at the edges, the way conjured things always were. His hands were still on the desk, not touching it, just near. The silver of his signet ring catching the office's muted light. "Here," he said, touching the 3rd sentence with one finger. "You've embedded the condition in a subordinate clause, which means the main clause reads as absolute, even though it isn't. Move the condition forward." She leaned in to see where he was indicating. Close enough that she could see the specific annotation, the precise point of his finger against the parchment. Close enough that the cedarwood and old book scent was there again, unhelpfully present. "If I move the condition forward, the sentence loses its parallel structure with the previous one," she said. "The parallel structure isn't serving you. You're using it for rhythm, not logic. Rhythm matters in legal language. Readability matters. Not as much as unambiguity." She straightened. He looked up at the same moment, and they were briefly, not close in the way of Wednesday, nothing like that, but proximate in the way of 2 people who had both moved toward the same document and had not yet moved apart. His eyes were... She had spent 2 years finding Draco Malfoy's eyes convenient to look slightly past. Grey with a quality she didn't have language for, something that on another face in another life she might have called depth. The sense of something behind the surface that the surface was being careful about. She looked slightly past them now. She stepped back. "I'll try restructuring the condition," she said. "It'll work." "You don't know that. I know your syntax. It'll work." She picked up her duplicate draft. The folder was already in her other hand. She had what she came for. Both things she came for, the stated and the unstated, the file and the 15 minutes of professional friction that had, she was aware, settled something in her chest that had been unsettled since she walked in. She hated that. She was becoming accustomed to hating it. "The malachite," she said, and then wondered why she'd said it. He looked at the stone on his corner of the desk. Something moved through his expression. Brief, private, the equivalent of a door opening a centimetre and then reconsidering. "It was my mother's," he said. She had not expected that. The simplicity of it, the absence of deflection. "It was my mother's. No qualification, no armouring of the information against her potential use of it. Just the plain fact, offered without ceremony." "She's well," Hermione said carefully. "She's in France." A pause. The door opening its centimetre again, then not closing quite. Just still. "She prefers it." She prefers it was doing considerable work as a sentence. Hermione, who had spent enough time in the vicinity of things left unsaid to recognize their shape, did not press it. She nodded once, in the way he sometimes nodded at her. "I see. That is real. I'm noting it," and moved toward the door. "Granger." She paused. "The condition clause," he said. "Try it beginning with where retrospective review is sought, rather than in cases where. Saves you 4 words and removes the ambiguity entirely." She thought about it for half a second. "Yes," she said. "That's right." She left. The revision took her 40 minutes and emerged with a restructured condition as clean and unambiguous as he had predicted. She read it 3 times. It was correct. It was, in fact, the best version of the sub-clause she'd produced, and she was honest enough to acknowledge that it had required his eye and his specific, unsentimental precision to find. She filed it without a note. He wouldn't expect one. But she found herself at lunch, sitting in the small Level 3 staff room and thinking not about the amendment. Thinking about she prefers it. The way he had said it. Not bitter, not performed indifference, just a fact lived with long enough to have had its sharp edges worn down by time, still weighty, but no longer cutting. His mother, in France. The malachite on the corner of his desk. She knew, in the general public way that everyone knew, something of what the Malfoy family had navigated since the war. She knew it the way she knew most things about people she had once been in direct conflict with. As information, as history, not as something she had examined for what it might mean in the present tense of the man across from her. She thought about him at 17, which she tried not to do, because 17 was too young for the things that had been asked of any of them, and thinking about it had a particular kind of ache. She thought about him at 29, which was now, which was the office with the malachite and the annotated archive files, and the small, precise handwriting on her returned notes. The ceramic dish, the wooden box, mattered once, handle with care. She pressed her thumb against her left hand, and then deliberately, as she had been doing, took it away. Friday arrived with the particular quality of a held breath. She sent him the revised amendment draft at 9 in the morning. His response came at past. A memo, the same precise fold as always, the same clipped acknowledgement. Subclause revision is clean. Will proceed to legal review. She set it aside. She reached for the next file. At 11, Williamson stopped by her office with the particular expression she had learned to associate with institutional complications. A mid-range wince that suggested something had gone wrong at a level above him and was about to become her problem. "The Wizengamot subcommittee," he said. She set down her quill. "They've requested a joint presentation," Williamson continued. "You and the Malfoy boy. Full proposal walkthrough, legal precedent review, the works." A pause. "Next Thursday." She absorbed this. A joint presentation. Combined departmental response. Their request, not ours. Williamson had the grace to look mildly apologetic. Political optics. They want both reform and legal enforcement presenting together. Shows unified departmental support or some such. After he left, she sat for a moment with the stillness of someone who had received information they were processing below the level of immediate response. A joint presentation. 6 days of preparation. 6 days of close, sustained, legitimate professional proximity. The kind that would require actual collaboration, not corridor exchanges and borrowed files, but side-by-side working, shared drafts, the dense, particular intimacy of 2 people building the same argument. She was aware, sitting in the quiet of her office with the rain still making its patient case against the Edinburgh window, that she was not as alarmed by this prospect as she should perhaps be. That somewhere below the professional calculation, below the strategic assessment of how to manage the preparation effectively, below all of it, there was something that was not alarm. She picked up her quill. She wrote him a single memo. precise, professional, brief. Williamson has briefed me on the subcommittee request. Joint preparation will require daily working sessions. I suggest we begin Monday morning, 9 o'clock, neutral meeting room. She folded it. She sent it. His response arrived in 11 minutes, faster than usual, she noticed, and then told herself she hadn't noticed. Monday, 9 o'clock. I'll book the room. She set the memo with the others. She opened the reclassification proposal and returned her attention to the statute hierarchy, the argument before the context, the structure he had shown her. Outside, the rain continued its long, patient conversation with the city. Inside, something had shifted in the weight distribution of her chest, subtle as a tide, barely perceptible, the kind of change you only recognized later, looking back when you could see clearly where one thing had ended and something else, unnamed and not yet understood, had quietly begun. The meeting room Draco had booked was on level 4. Hermione arrived at 8:55 because she arrived early to everything, had done since the age of 11, and saw no reason to alter this on account of who she was arriving to meet, and found the room already unlocked, already lit, already containing a neat stack of relevant files on the table and 2 cups of tea, one of which was still producing a thin thread of steam. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He had arrived before her. He had made tea. She filed this information in the same internal category as the archive retrieval and the fair weather ruling and the careful weight of blotting parchment, the category she had not yet named, because naming it would require a decision about what to do with it. She sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The tea was strong and slightly too hot, which was exactly how she took it, and she did not examine how he knew that. He arrived at 9 precisely. No coat. He had clearly come from his office rather than from outside, which meant he had been here already, had set the room up, and then returned to collect something, which meant the tea had been made with enough lead time to still be drinkable when she arrived. She did not comment on any of this. Granger. He sat across from her, opened his own folder with the brisk efficiency of someone ready to work, and looked at her with the expectant attention of a man who considered punctuality a baseline courtesy and was prepared to begin. "I've structured the presentation in 4 sections," she said, matching his register without difficulty. This was, she had noticed, one of the specific things that worked between them. They could begin. No warm-up, no social scaffolding, no performance of the conversational rituals that most professional relationships required. They simply started from whatever point the work demanded, and it was, she had stopped pretending otherwise, a relief. "Show me." She turned her outline toward him. He read it with the focused stillness she had catalogued, the slight compression of his attention when something interested him, the brief pause when something didn't. "You've put the creature classification reform in section 3, he said. "It's the most technically complex element. I want the committee oriented to the legal framework first. The committee will disengage before they reach it, lead with the reform, establish why it matters, then build the legal architecture underneath." She looked at her outline. She had made this argument herself, once, to a different audience. Had told Malfoy, in fact, that she'd ordered the proposal's argument before context, because she wanted readers to understand the background first, and he had told her the Wizengamot wanted the argument, and she had revised accordingly. She was doing it again. The instinct toward thoroughness over impact, the scholar's habit of establishing every premise before the conclusion, the impulse that made her papers excellent, and her presentations occasionally, in certain rooms, too careful by half. "You're right," she said. He looked up, slightly surprised, she thought, or what passed for surprise in someone whose legible range was compressed to the width of a postage stamp. "That was quick. You were right about the paragraph structure too. I can recognize a pattern in my own tendencies." Something in his expression shifted. The fractional warmth that was his equivalent of a more demonstrative response, the slight unlocking around the eyes. "Most people can't. Most people aren't paying attention." He looked at her for a moment with that plain, stripped quality. Then he looked back at the outline. "Move the reform to Section 1. Keep the legal precedents in 2. Use 3 for implementation mechanics. The committee will have questions about practical application. Get ahead of them." She was already making notes. "The Aldridge precedent should be our anchor in Section 2. It's the clearest example of a retrospective provision surviving challenge intact." "Agreed. I'll draft the legal precedent walkthrough if you take the reform overview." "And implementation mechanics. Together." He said it without inflection, as though it were purely logistical, which it was. "The mechanics will require both frameworks to be legible simultaneously." Together. There it was again, the same small word from 2 weeks ago in the corridor, landing in the same place. She wrote implementation, joint on her outline, and did not think about the word. They worked through the morning with the focused momentum of 2 people who had, over 2 years of professional friction, developed a working rhythm neither of them had explicitly chosen. She drafted, he interrogated her logic. She pushed back on his interrogations, and occasionally won and occasionally revised. And the thing that emerged from this process was, consistently, frustratingly, better than either of them produced alone. By noon, they had a complete structural outline and the first section drafted in full. "Lunch," she said, more to herself than to him, registering hunger with mild surprise, as though she had forgotten her body had requirements. He closed his folder. She noticed he did not move immediately toward the door, which was unusual. Draco Malfoy had, in her experience, a clean relationship with exits, used them decisively and without lingering. "There's a place on level 6, he said. "The canteen there is less populated." She looked at him. "Less populated," she repeated. "The level 2 canteen has Williamson in it at this hour." A pause. "He'll want to discuss the presentation." This was true. Williamson had a gift for finding people in canteens and converting their lunch into an impromptu briefing. She had lost 45 minutes to this on Wednesday alone. "Level 6, she said. The Level 6 canteen was smaller than the main one, frequented largely by the Department of Mysteries support staff, who ate with the particular quiet intensity of people whose work required sustained secrecy and who had extended this habit to their meals. The food was the same, standard ministry canteen fare, solid rather than inspired. But the room had a low ceiling and high-backed wooden booths that created a sense of enclosure, of being in a smaller, more private world than the open atrium of Level 2. They sat across from each other in a corner booth with plates of something warm and the particular quiet of two people who had been working hard enough that conversation was not immediately required. She ate. She was aware of him eating, the ordinary human fact of it, which she had not been in a position to observe before. He ate the way he did most things, without performance, without self-consciousness, with a kind of straightforward attention to the thing in front of him. "Can I ask you something?" she said, before she had fully decided to ask. He looked up, waited. The Malfoy Foundation. She had read about it. Everyone in the magical legal community had read about it. The philanthropic organization he had established 3 years ago, quietly, without press, directing substantial portions of the Malfoy estate funds toward magical creature welfare and the rehabilitation of war-affected magical families. It was not publicly connected to his name in most documents. She had found it by accident, following a funding trail in a different piece of research. "You don't publicize it." A silence. Not uncomfortable. The specific quality of his silences was never uncomfortable, she had decided. It was simply dense with things he was deciding whether to say. "No," he said. "Why not?" The question was direct, which was the only way she knew how to ask questions she actually wanted answered. He did not seem troubled by its directness, looked at her with a steady grey attention, and appeared to be genuinely considering, not deflecting. "Because it isn't for publication," he said at last. "It's restitution. A beat. Those are different things." She absorbed this. The word restitution landed with the weight of something considered and precise, chosen not for effect, but because it was the accurate term for what he meant. "Restitution implies a debt," she said. "Yes. Simply, flatly, without drama." "To whom?" He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the booth, the low hum of the canteen continued. Distant voices, the clink of cutlery, the muffled industry of a place full of people engaged in their own separate concerns. Inside, the wooden walls created a quiet so specific it felt like a different quality of air. "To people I can name," he said, "and some I can't." She thought about the Malachite, the mother in France, the 17-year-old on a tower in a storm. She thought about her own left hand, the ghost of a ring, the wooden box. "I understand that," she said quietly. "Having a debt that's shapeless, that can't be fully paid." He looked at her with something that was not surprise but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had expected the conversation to go somewhere manageable and had found instead that it went somewhere true. "Yes," he said, "just that." They finished lunch in the specific quiet of two people who had said something real to each other and were living with it. The afternoon session was different from the morning. Not worse, not more difficult. But something had shifted in the quality of the shared air, a loosening of the professional surface, the slight lowering of the register that happened between people who have, without planning to, exchanged something personal and cannot entirely pretend otherwise. They worked on the implementation mechanics, which required sustained close attention to a single document, both of them leaning over the table with their respective drafts and a shared working copy between them. She noticed, without cataloguing it, that he had stopped moving to the far side of the table when she moved closer. that the professional distance had contracted to something that felt simply like proximity between people engaged in the same problem. At one point, she reached for the working copy, and her hand landed near his on the table, not touching a centimeter's gap between them. And neither of them moved for a moment, both reading the same paragraph. And the atmosphere in the room had the quality of something held very still so as not to disturb it. She moved her hand. He turned the page. They kept working. At 4:30, she straightened and rolled her neck and felt the vertebrae protest from hours of forward lean. "Tomorrow," she said, "we can finish the precedent section. I'll have the legal review completed before 9, he said, "so we can incorporate it directly." She was gathering her files when she noticed his jacket draped over the chair beside him. He had taken it off at some point in the afternoon, which she hadn't registered when it happened, and was now in shirt sleeves, which was simply factual, simply ordinary, the unremarkable reality of a man who had been working for 7 hours and had made himself comfortable. She was aware of it. She looked at her files. "The thing you said," he said unexpectedly. She paused. He was still looking at the working copy, not at her, his voice carrying the quality of something said to the room rather than directed, as though the lack of eye contact made it permissible. "About a debt that can't be fully paid." She waited. "Does it?" He stopped. She had never heard him stop mid-sentence. He always knew what he meant before he said it, always arrived at his words fully formed. The stop itself told her something. "Does it diminish?" he said at last. "With time?" The question was so carefully not about Ron that it was entirely about him. She understood that. She understood also that he was asking something else below it, asking whether the weight of old wrong things, of guilt worn long enough to have had its edges worn down, but never its substance, whether that was a permanent condition or a recoverable one. She thought about it honestly. "I think it changes shape," she said. "It doesn't diminish, but it stops, occupying the same space. You learn to live in the rest of the room." He was quiet. "That's not a comfort," she said. "I know." "No." A pause. "But it's true. That's worth more." She stood there for a moment in the level 4 meeting room with her files under her arm and the working copy of their joint presentation on the table between them and the enchanted window showing a city going to evening, the lights of it reflecting warm and golden puddles of spent rain. She left without saying anything else. But in the lift descending, she stood very still and let herself, just briefly, just for the 4 seconds of the descent, feel the full precise weight of how much she had told him, and how much, without words, he had told her back. The lift arrived. She walked out into the atrium. The rain had stopped. Above the ministry's enchanted ceiling, somewhere beyond the layers of stone and spell and the city's own density, there was presumably a sky going from grey to the first quiet dark of evening. She walked home through streets that smelled of ozone and wet stone, and something she couldn't name, her files under her arm, her left hand empty, the night air cold and specific against her face, and felt, tentatively and without trust, the barest edge of something she was not yet ready to call by its name. Tuesday arrived with clear skies. Hermione noticed this from her bedroom window at 6 in the morning, standing with her tea and the particular interior quiet of someone who had slept for the first time in 2 weeks without interruption. Not deeply, she was not yet capable of deep, but continuously, which was its own small restoration. She had woken with the specific groggy heaviness of genuine rest and lain still for several minutes, simply experiencing it, the unfamiliar weight of her own body against the mattress, before the morning assembled itself around her, and she rose. The wooden box was still in the bedside drawer. She had not opened it, but she had stopped registering its presence with the tight, careful awareness of something dangerous nearby. It was simply there, the way the past was simply there, in the room, part of the furniture, no longer requiring active management. She took her tea to the window and watched the sky do its quiet work of lightening, the particular London blue of early morning before the city's noise filled in. And she thought not about Ron, not about the ring, not about 2 years slowly revising themselves from loss into history. She thought about a question asked to a room. Does it diminish with time? She had given him an honest answer. She knew it had landed in him because of the quality of the silence that followed it, not the closed silence of a man who had heard something and dismissed it, but the open kind, the silence of genuine receipt. She had learned to distinguish them. He was not a man who performed consideration. When he was still, he was actually still, actually inside the thing being said. And what came out the other side of that stillness was, always it had been in 2 years of watching it without wanting to, worth something. She drank her tea and thought about restitution, about the shapeless debt and the money directed quietly toward people he could name and some he couldn't, the foundation without his name on it, the malachite on the corner of the desk. She thought about the particular weight of a person who carried their guilt privately, who did not perform it or weaponize it or use it as a claim on other people's sympathy, who simply bore it, restructured their life around it, made it into something that built rather than destroyed. She had not, she realized, given him enough credit for this. She had known it. She had assessed it, filed it under the revised category she developed for him over 2 years. The category she kept having to expand to fit the person he was actually revealing himself to be. But knowing it and feeling it were apparently different, and she had crossed somewhere in the level 4 meeting room yesterday from one to the other. She went to get ready for work. She did not examine this crossing too carefully. She was still, in many ways, a person who needed the firm ground of professional purpose beneath her feet before she could look at anything else. And there was a presentation to finish, and that was where her attention belonged. She believed this almost entirely. He was already in the meeting room when she arrived. This had become, without either of them remarking on it, the pattern. He arrived first. She arrived before 9, both of them settled and readier before the hour struck. The tea was on the table, hers still steaming. She sat down. She wrapped her hands around the cup. She looked across at him. He was reading through the legal precedent review he had completed that morning, his quill making small, precise marks in the margin, a slight furrow between his brows that indicated active disagreement with something. His own previous work, most likely, a higher standard applied in the light of the morning than in whatever late hour he'd drafted it. She watched him for a moment. There was a quality to him, she thought, in the unobserved moments. a quietness that wasn't the same as the composed stillness he deployed in public, in meetings, in the professional performances of their daily department life. This was less constructed. The architecture was the same. The upright posture, the contained quality of his gestures, the face that disclosed precisely what he decided to disclose and no more. But the intention behind it was different. This was not performance. This was simply him, in a room, before an audience had assembled. She had very rarely seen him when he didn't know he was being seen. "The Marchbanks citation in Section 2, she said, when it felt like she had been watching too long. "I want to reconsider it." He looked up without the startle of someone caught. He had known she was there, she thought, had perhaps known since she opened the door. He simply turned his attention from one thing to her, fluidly, without recalibration. "Why?" "It supports the precedent argument, but it's from 1962. I think it will invite the committee to question currency. The Fairweather ruling is stronger and more recent. Fairweather doesn't cover the same jurisdictional scope." "It covers enough." She opened her copy of the section. "Look, if we use Marchbanks here, we're inviting a challenge on historical applicability. Fairweather's scope is narrower, but its standing is unimpeachable. It's the safer anchor." He looked at her draft. She watched him think. The small compression of his attention, the brief downward flicker. "You'd need a secondary citation to cover the jurisdictional gap," he said. "The 2004 Heatherton Review. It's not primary precedent, but it bridges the gap between Fairweather's scope and our application." A pause. "That works," he said, which was, from Draco Malfoy, the equivalent of a standing ovation. She made the note. They moved forward. The morning had a different quality from the previous days. Something was easier in the room. She noticed it first as an absence, the absence of the low-level friction that usually occupied some portion of their shared space. Not the working friction. That was still there, sharp and useful and essential to the quality of what they produced together. But the other kind, the personal friction, the slight atmospheric pressure of two people being careful around something. It was lower today. She wasn't sure which of them had lowered it, or whether it had simply, in the way of these things, resolved itself without either of them doing anything. At 10:30, he made a correction to her section overview that was technically accurate and contextually wrong, and she told him so, and explained why, and he argued back, and they went 3 rounds on it before she produced the specific Wisingamot procedural precedent that settled it in her favour. And he sat back in his chair with the expression she had come to privately treasure, the slight press of his mouth, the concession of someone who lost rarely and accepted it well. "That was a reasonable argument," he said. "It was a correct argument." Reasonable and correct are not synonyms. In this case, they were both. The press of his mouth became fractionally something else, the compression of something that wanted to become a smile and was being carefully managed. She had seen this perhaps 4 times in 2 years. She had catalogued them all. She looked back at her outline. At noon they stopped again, and this time there was no conversation about where. They simply went to level 6, settled into the same corner booth, ordered from the same limited menu, and the repetition of it had a quality that she recognized without wanting to name. the quality of a pattern that had become a habit that was in the process of becoming something with more specific gravity. "Thursday is in 2 days," he said. "I'm aware. The presentation is ready. It will be after this afternoon." She looked at her plate. "You're not concerned? About the presentation?" "About the committee, the retrospective clause, whether the fair weather approach will hold." He was quiet for a moment. "I think it's the best argument available. If it doesn't hold, it's not because of the work." A pause. "It would be political. And if it's political, then we regroup and find another approach." He said it with the even practicality of a person who had learned, at some expense, that obstacles were not the same as endings. The reform doesn't fail because one pathway is blocked. She looked at him. "You weren't always like that." "Like what?" "Pragmatic about the long view, continuing." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression, slow, not defensive, the consideration of someone sitting with an honest observation rather than deflecting it. "No," he said, "I wasn't." She nodded. "You were, though," he said unexpectedly. "Even at school. The persistence, the refusing to stop." She thought about that. It didn't always feel like a choice. "Most things that look like character from the outside are like that," he said. "You do them because you can't do otherwise, and eventually it becomes who you are." She thought about her grandmother's earrings and a pressed flower in a wooden box. About a ring placed carefully among things that mattered once. About the particular work of becoming someone who could hold the loss and still come to the table, still argue about statute citations, still continue. "Yes," she said, "I think that's right." They finished lunch in companionable quiet, the easy silence of people who had said enough. The afternoon was the last real working session before the Thursday presentation, and they both knew it, and the knowledge gave the room a slightly heightened quality. Not pressure, but something adjacent to it, the focused attention of a final pass. They went through the full presentation structure twice. She argued a transition. He improved it. She improved his improvement. He challenged her opening statement, and she revised it to something stronger than either of them had initially proposed. They divided the speaking sections with an efficiency that required almost no negotiation. Certain passages were clearly hers, certain ones clearly his, and the division landed as though it had been planned rather than felt. At one point, she was reading a section aloud, testing cadence, a habit she had when preparing spoken presentations, and she became aware of him not working, but listening, not auditing her for errors, simply listening to the shape of it, the logic moving through language, with the focused attention she had seen him give to things he found genuinely worth his time. She finished the paragraph. "The last sentence," he said. "Too long? Too careful. You're hedging the conclusion. State it." She read it again. He was right. She could hear it now, the slight retreat from her own strongest point, the qualifier that softened the blow and therefore softened the argument. "If I state it without the hedge, the committee will push back harder." "Let them push back. You have the answer. Don't preemptively concede ground you don't need to concede." She sat with this. Don't preemptively concede ground you don't need to concede. She rewrote the sentence. He listened to her read the revision, the fractional press of his mouth again, not the managed almost smile, something quieter. Approval, she thought, with the slightly vertiginous quality of realizing she had been working this entire afternoon with some portion of her attention oriented toward whether the work was good enough to earn it. Not his approval in the general sense, his specifically. She looked down at her draft. "We're ready for Thursday," she said. "Yes." She began gathering her files. He did the same, and for a few minutes the room had the texture of an ending. The small sounds of papers organized, folders closed, the working space returning to neutral. Granger. She looked up. He was standing, his files under one arm, watching her with a plain grey gaze that had stopped feeling like assessment and started feeling. She admitted this now, here, with the afternoon light falling across the meeting table and nowhere left to look past him, like recognition. "You've been—" He stopped. The same stop as before, the uncharacteristic pause of a man arriving at a sentence from the wrong direction. "The work on this presentation. It's— the argument we've built is stronger than anything either department has submitted in years." It was, she understood, not quite what he had started to say. But it was what he had found a way to say, and in the specific economy of Draco Malfoy's expressions, in the particular careful grammar of a man who had learned to protect what mattered by keeping it close, she heard the rest of it underneath. "You've been—" She held his gaze. "So is the legal architecture," she said, which was also not quite what she meant, but carried what she meant inside it, and she saw him receive it. The slight opening, the centimetre door, the brief, unguarded moment before the composure resettled. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. 9 o'clock Thursday, she said. "Outside the Wizengamot chamber. I'll be there." She walked into the corridor and did not look back, and the thing in her chest that she had been carefully declining to name had developed, somewhere between level 4 and the lift, a shape specific enough to be unmistakable. She took the stairs instead of the lift. She needed the extra 30 seconds. She used them standing in the stairwell between level 3 and 2, one hand on the cold iron banister, looking at nothing in particular, acknowledging quietly, privately, without ceremony, that she was in a considerable amount of difficulty, and that she was not, she found with some surprise, afraid of it. The presentation went well. This was not a surprise. They had built something genuinely strong, and Hermione had enough experience with the Wizengamot's various subcommittees to read the room accurately, to know the difference between the committee's performative skepticism and its actual resistance. Thursday's subcommittee had deployed the former in the first 20 minutes and shifted visibly to genuine engagement by the midpoint of Section 2. The retrospective clause survived its challenge. The fair weather citation held. The implementation mechanics generated 3 substantive questions and no procedural objections, which was, in her experience, the closest thing to enthusiasm the committee produced. She and Draco had stood side by side at the presentation table in the chamber's anteroom, passing the argument between them with the fluency of people who had built it together, who knew not only their own sections, but the logic beneath the others, who could respond to a committee question that fell in the gap between their divisions without hesitation or visible negotiation. Afterwards, in the corridor outside the chamber, she had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and there had been a moment, brief, charged, the specific quality of shared work completed well, where neither of them said anything, and the silence had said something neither of them had authorized. Then Williamson had appeared from the lift, and the moment collapsed into professional noise, and they had been separated by the various institutional requirements of a successful presentation. And she had not had another conversation with him alone since. That had been Thursday. It was now Saturday morning. Hermione did not, as a rule, spend Saturday mornings in a state of unproductive interior agitation. She had errands and reading and the weekly flu call with her parents that she had finally managed with reasonable composure, had told them about Ron in the even, careful tone of someone presenting a difficult document, had accepted her mother's quiet distress and her father's steady, practical concern, and had felt, afterwards, the specific exhaustion of having told the truth to people who loved her. She had also, on Friday evening, seen Ron, not arranged, accidental, the specific cruelty of a city that was simultaneously enormous and, among the magical population, remarkably small. She had been on Diagon Alley for a new quill and a reference text she needed, moving through the familiar covered street in the late afternoon gold, and she had rounded the corner near Flourish and Blots, and there he was. He was with someone, a woman she didn't recognize. Muggle-born from the look of her, young, laughing at something Ron had said with the open, uncomplicated delight of someone in the early stages of whatever this was. Ron was laughing too, the big, uncomplicated Weasley laugh she had loved for years. And he looked fine. He looked whole. He looked like a person who had made a difficult decision and was discovering that the other side of it contained something worth having. She had turned before he saw her, had walked in the other direction, quickly and then more quickly, and had gone home and made tea and sat at her kitchen table for a long time looking at nothing. She was not, she told herself, devastated. She was honest enough to distinguish between grief and devastation. This was grief, real and present, the specific pain of watching 2 years of her life continue without her in it. But underneath it, something else was present, something she had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. Relief. Not at his happiness, or not only that, at the evidence of what she had already known but not felt, that the ending was right, that what she had lost was real, but the loss was not a mistake, that the life she was walking back into, the kitchen and the quill and the Wednesday mornings in a level 4 meeting room with strong tea and precise arguments, and a man who looked at her as though she were actually worth looking at, that life was not a consolation. It was simply hers. She had sat with this for a long time. Saturday afternoon, she went to the ministry. This was not unusual. She worked most weekends, in the comfortable way of someone for whom work was not a burden, but a native climate. The department was quiet on Saturdays, staffed by a skeleton of on-call personnel, the corridors carrying the particular acoustic quality of large spaces occupied by few people, footsteps echoing where they would be absorbed on a weekday by the ambient noise of an institution in full function. She was not expecting anyone else to be there. She was wrong. His office door was open, which was her first indication. She saw the light of it from the corridor, his specific desk lamp, a narrow, focused beam that she had noticed before, the the kind that illuminated work without flooding the room, exactly the quantity of light required and no more. She paused at the door without knocking. He was at his desk, in weekend clothes, not the ministry charcoal, not the professional severity of his working wardrobe, but something simpler, dark, the slightly loosened quality of a person who had come in without expecting to see anyone. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He was reading something dense, his forearm resting on the desk, the malachite catching the narrow lamplight from its corner. She must have made a sound, or moved, because he looked up, a beat of stillness. Granger. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated, the expression of a man recalibrating quickly from the private quality of solitude. "I didn't know you'd be in," she said. "I didn't know you would be either." She should continue to her own office. She had files to review, a new briefing to begin, perfectly legitimate professional reasons to be here that had nothing to do with the fact that she had spent most of Saturday morning sitting with a relief she didn't know what to do with, and had found, without entirely planning to, that her feet had brought her here. "The Marchbanks citation," she said. "I want to write a follow-up brief for the committee while the presentation is fresh, in case they want supplementary material." He looked at her. She had the uncomfortable sense that he was reading the specific text of her, the real version underneath the professional sentence, with the same precision he applied to statute language. "Come in then," he said. She took the chair across from his desk, not the one she used in her own office, which was the visitor's chair, but the one beside the bookcase, which put her at a slight angle to him rather than in direct opposition, a geometry that felt different without her being able to say precisely why. She opened her satchel. She found her notebook. For a while they worked in parallel, she drafting, he reading, the shared silence of two people in a room with the same natural relationship to quiet industry. Through the narrow office window, the afternoon light was specific and golden in the way of autumn light in the late hours, low and long-angled, laying itself across the floor in slanted rectangles. "You saw Weasley," he said. She went still. Her quill stopped. "Yesterday," he said. Not a question. His voice was level, carrying no particular colour, just the plain directness of a statement. She looked at him. "How did you know that?" "You came in on a Saturday with a reason that didn't require Saturday." A pause. "And you look like someone who has looked at something difficult and is sitting with it rather than running from it." She held his gaze. "Is that an observation or a diagnosis?" "An observation." The quiet fell again for a moment, and then, "Are you all right?" The question in his voice had none of the careful tenderness that made kindness difficult for her to receive. It was direct and plain, and asked without the performance of concern, which was, she had learned this about herself in these past weeks, what she could actually accept. The thing that didn't require her to be soft in order to receive it. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was him and he was asking without asking for anything in return, "I saw him with someone, and I felt sad, and then I felt relieved, and the relief was harder to sit with than the sadness." He was quiet. "Because it meant the ending was right," he said. "Yes." Another silence, the open kind. He was looking at her with the grey gaze that was. She had stopped pretending otherwise, here, on a Saturday afternoon in his office with the autumn light on the floor, and no professional scaffolding available to hide behind. The way she wanted to be looked at, without requirement, without performance, with the simple, serious attention of someone for whom she was worth it. "Malfoy," she said. "Granger. I need to tell you something." He waited. She put down her quill. She straightened in the chair, which was her body's instinct before difficult things. A slight gathering, the spine doing what it could. "I've been..." She stopped, tried again. "These past weeks, the work, the sessions." She looked at him steadily. "I have not been coming to your office every day solely for professional reasons." The quality of the room changed. He did not move. He was very still in the way that was different from his composed stillness. This was not managed, not performed. It was the stillness of a person receiving something and not yet having decided what to do with it. "I know," he said quietly. She looked at him. "You know." "I have also," he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing each word as though placing stones in a path. "Not been making tea for two every morning for purely professional reasons." The autumn light moved on the floor between them. She felt her heart do something she had not felt in a considerable time. Not the anxious lurch of grief or the hollow ache of loss, but something with actual forward momentum, something that pulled toward rather than away. "This is complicated," she said. Not an objection, a statement of reality, the honest audit she could not help applying to everything. "Yes, we work together. Yes, you were, we were, for years we were." "I know what we were," he said. Something moved in his voice, brief, heavier than his usual register, the weight of a past he carried without performing. "I know exactly what I was." She looked at him. "So do I," she said. "And I know what you are now. I've been watching you for 2 years, and I know the difference." He held her gaze. The centimeter door. She could see it, the slight opening, the thing behind the surface of him that the surface was so careful about. Present, not closing. "Hermione," he said. Her own name, in his voice, with no professional coating on it. Just the word, just her. She stood up. She was not, she had established, afraid of this. She crossed the space between the chair and his desk, which was not a large space, which was nevertheless the largest distance she had crossed in recent memory. And she stood at the edge of the desk and looked at him in the lamplight with the afternoon gold going to early dusk around them. He rose. Not quickly. He did almost nothing quickly, but with the focused deliberateness of someone who had decided something and was following the decision through. He was taller than she was, which she was abstractly aware of in the corridors, in meetings, in all the professional contexts of 2 years. Up close, it registered differently. Everything registered differently up close. The cedarwood and old books, the specific grey of his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw of a man holding himself carefully. "This will be..." he started. "I know," she said. "I'm not..." He stopped. "I don't do things. I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight between them, the malachite on the corner of the desk, the autumn gold going from the floor. She watched him decide. She could see it, the internal movement of it, the careful man who had learned to protect everything important, arriving at the edge of no longer protecting this particular thing. His hand came up, slow, unhurried, the way he did everything, and his fingers touched her jaw, barely. the tip of his fingers against the line of her jaw, the lightest possible contact, a question rather than a statement. She did not move away. His thumb traced a line from the angle of her jaw toward her chin, and she felt it through her whole body, the precise, careful weight of it, and her breath changed. "This is not." His voice was low, stripped of its professional surface entirely, just the actual voice underneath. "I need you to know this is not nothing. For me, this is not—" "I know," she said, and the words came out softer than she intended, softer than she had anything in weeks. "Draco, I know." He looked at her. The door, fully open now. No centimeter, no managed distance. Just him, directly, with the full gravity of a person who had kept everything close for so long that choosing to let something near was significant in a way that couldn't be minimized. She reached up and covered his hand with hers where it rested against her jaw. His eyes closed briefly. One breath. When he opened them, she was still there, which appeared to matter in a way she didn't have language for yet, but intended to find. Outside, the autumn light had gone from gold to the first quiet grey of early evening. Inside, the lamplight held. The malachite on the corner of the desk caught it and held it and gave it back warmer than it had arrived. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. Not yet. Not this moment, which was already, in its careful stillness, more than either of them had permitted themselves to reach for in a very long time. Sunday came in quietly. No rain. No dramatic atmospheric declaration. Just the pale, considered light of an October morning moving through Hermione's bedroom curtains with the unhurried patience of something that had nowhere else to be, laying itself across the floor in long, thin rectangles, warming the wood by degrees. She had slept again. Deeply this time? The other kind, the kind she had forgotten was possible, where consciousness simply stopped and released her fully, and did not hand her back to herself until her body was ready. She lay still for several minutes after waking, cataloguing the quality of it, the way you might examine something you'd found and weren't certain was real. She thought about his hand against her jaw, the weight of it, the specific, careful deliberateness, the way his eyes had closed for that one breath when she covered his hand with hers, as though he had been braced for something that didn't come, and the not coming of it required a moment of private adjustment. They had stood like that for a long time. She didn't know how long. The room had its own time that afternoon, slow and amber. Eventually, she had lowered her hand. He had lowered his. They had looked at each other in the lamplight with the particular quality of two people standing at the beginning of something and being, for once, honest about it. She had gathered her things. He had walked her to the door of his office, which he had not done before, the small, ordinary courtesy of it landing with disproportionate significance. At the door she had stopped and looked at him. "Monday," she had said. "Monday," he had agreed. She had walked down the corridor and into the lift and out through the atrium and into the street, and the October evening had been cold and specific against her face. And she had walked home feeling like someone who had set down a weight they had been carrying so long they had stopped registering it as weight. She arrived at the ministry on Monday at 8:40. The lift descended with its familiar held breath quality. She stepped out into level 2, smoothed her lapel, and walked toward the Policy and Reform Office with her satchel over her shoulder, and her expression, she was aware of this, not arranged into its usual calibration. Not wide open, but different. The subtle unlocking of a face that has decided something and is no longer spending energy on the maintenance of the previous arrangement. Her office, her desk, the Edinburgh window with its autumn gold. She had been at work for perhaps 15 minutes when he knocked. The knock was the same as always, more formality than request. The knuckle against the door frame, the slight pause that acknowledged the threshold before crossing it. But when she looked up, his expression was different from its usual settled composure. Not agitated. He was not a man who did agitation in any visible register. But the careful layer was slightly lower, the morning light finding something in his face that the fluorescent efficiency of the department's working hours usually obscured. He was carrying 2 cups of tea. She looked at them. He set one on her desk with the straightforward lack of ceremony of someone doing a thing they have decided to do and are not going to perform any further significance around. He kept the other and remained standing, which was his way. The subcommittee sent preliminary feedback this morning, he said. Already. Williamson forwarded it at 7. The dry compression that was his version of commentary on Williamson's hours. The retrospective clause is approved in principle. They want minor language adjustments in the implementation section. She looked at him. Minor. 2 sentences, neither of them substantive. A pause. The reform proceeds. She felt the quality of this settle into her. Not triumph, which was too loud for how it felt, but something quieter and more solid. The specific satisfaction of work that had taken the long road and arrived. We should go over the adjustment requests together, she said. Yes. This afternoon. I'll come at 2. He looked at her. She looked at him. The professional surface of the conversation held, and beneath it something else held too. The Saturday lamplight, the malachite, the careful weight of a hand against her jaw. Both things present simultaneously, each in its right register, neither requiring the other to diminish. Draco, she said. He stilled. She had used his name on Saturday, had said it without the professional coating, and now she used it again in the ordinary Monday morning of her office as though it was simply his name. Which it was, which she was choosing to use, which meant something specific to both of them and required no elaboration. Something moved in his face, the door fully open. 2 o'clock, he said. 2 o'clock, she agreed. He left. She turned to her work with a cup of strong tea warming between her palms and the enchanted Edinburgh sky doing its patient golden business beyond the window. The adjustment requests took 40 minutes. They were minor, as he had said, a clarification of the implementation timeline in 1 sentence, a rewording of the oversight mechanism in another. Neither required significant revision. They worked through them at her desk with the ease of 2 people for whom collaboration had become, over weeks and without announcement, their natural mode. When they finished, he didn't leave immediately. He remained in the chair across from her desk, actually sitting in it for once rather than standing behind it. And she remained at her desk, and neither of them reached for the next professional task. And the afternoon had the specific quality of a space held open. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. About what you said. In the level 6 canteen. She looked at him steadily. About doing things because you can't do otherwise, and eventually it becomes who you are. I remember. I think I've been... She paused, finding the accurate words, because she was constitutionally incapable of being imprecise about things that mattered. I think I spent a long time arranging my life around stability, around the things that were reliable. Ron was... He was part of that architecture, someone I had known forever, who fit into everything, who was legible to me. He was listening in the way he did when something was worth his full attention, not performing attentiveness, actually there. And when that ended, I thought the thing I needed was to rebuild the stability, the architecture, find the new version of reliable. She looked at her hands on the desk. But I don't think that's what I need. I think what I've discovered in the past few weeks is that I want to be surprised, challenged, seen by someone who doesn't need me to be manageable. She looked up at him. You don't need me to be manageable, she said. Something moved through his expression, deep, genuine, the full interior movement of a person receiving something that costs the person giving it. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I need you to be exactly what you are. A pause, the careful placement of words, which has always been more than I expected and different from what I told myself I thought. When did that change? She asked. What you told yourself you thought. He considered this with the genuine attention he gave to things that required accurate answer. 3rd year, he said. When you hit me. She stared at him, the compression of his mouth, fully there this time, not managed at all, a real thing. The smile she had seen perhaps 4 times and had been cataloguing without knowing she was building toward this. She laughed. She had not laughed, she realized, not properly, not from the chest, in weeks. It arrived without warning, and was warm and real, and the room was briefly full of it. He was watching her laugh with the expression of a man who has accomplished something he intended and is not going to be modest about it. 3rd year, she repeated, recovering. You were furious and correct, and you didn't ask anyone's permission. Something quieter entered his voice beneath the dry register. I told myself I thought you were insufferable, and you were. But insufferable and compelling are not mutually exclusive. You have a remarkable talent, she said, for revealing things in the most deliberately understated possible way. One of several skills. She looked at him across the desk. The afternoon light had shifted, moving the Edinburgh gold from the left side of the window to the centre, laying itself across the surface between them. Come here, she said. He looked at her. A beat. He rose from the chair with the deliberate unhurriedness that was entirely characteristic, and he came around the side of the desk, and she turned her chair to face him, and he was standing close, not as close as Saturday, not the lamplight and the almost, but close enough that she was aware of every centimetre between them as specific and charged. She stood up. They were face to face. His height, her nearness to it, the grey eyes that she was no longer looking past. I'm not, he said quietly, uncomplicated. I know. My history is yours, she said. I know your history. I've known it since we were 11 years old. I'm not talking to you across the distance of it. I'm talking to you here. He looked at her. Here, he said, as though testing the word, what it meant, whether it could bear the weight of what she was using it to hold. "Yes," she said. He reached up, and this time there was no question in it. His hand came to her face with the same care as Saturday, but without the tentativeness, the question already answered, his thumb tracing the same line from jaw to chin, and she turned her face slightly into it with the involuntary honesty of a body that had made a decision before the mind finished deliberating. His other hand came to her waist, light, present. She put her hand against his chest, felt the steady, specific reality of his heartbeat beneath her palm, faster than his composed exterior suggested, which told her something, which told her he was not as steady as he looked, and had not been, perhaps, for longer than this moment. "Hermione," he said. Just that. The name without its professional distance. She looked up at him. She kissed him. Not tentatively. She had decided, and she did not do things tentatively once she had decided them. She pressed her mouth to his with the full, honest intention of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through rigorous consideration and was now committed to the result. For one breath, he was still receiving it, the surprise of being chosen so directly by someone who did not do things by accident. Then his hand at her waist drew her closer, and he kissed her back with a thoroughness that matched her own, and the distance between them. All of it, every professional inch of 2 years, every careful managed centimetre, closed entirely. It lasted long enough that the Edinburgh light shifted again. Long enough that she was aware of nothing beyond his hand in her hair and his mouth, and the warm, anchored reality of being held by someone who was holding her specifically, deliberately, as though she was something worth the particular gravity of both his hands. When they separated, she remained where she was, her hand still at his chest, his forehead tipping down to rest against hers. "3rd year," she said again, quietly. His voice was lower than usual, a different quality of warmth. "I threw water on your ferret form the next day, intentionally." A sound that was, entirely, genuinely, a laugh. Low, brief, real. She had never heard it before, and it arrived in her chest like something she intended to hear again. "I know," he said. "I know you did." She pulled back enough to look at him. The composed face, the winter-light hair, the grey eyes. His, directly, no managed distance, no professional surface, just the actual person behind everything she had spent 2 years learning to see. The malachite was not here. The lamplight was not the same amber. This was afternoon, and Edinburgh gold, and her office, and 2 cups of tea cooling on the desk. And it was, she thought, with the quiet certainty of someone recognizing a true thing. Enough. More than enough. The ordinary hours of a Monday afternoon in a familiar room, and a man who had made tea for 2 every morning for weeks without being asked, and the specific, uncomplicated fact of being here, with him, without architecture or management or stability as the primary aim. Just this. She kissed him again, briefer, quieter, the punctuation of a decision rather than its announcement. He tucked a curl behind her ear with the particular deliberateness of someone learning a new thing they intend to become fluent in. Outside, the enchanted Edinburgh sky held its autumn gold. The old city going quietly about the business of being itself in the long afternoon, faithful and unhurried. Inside, neither of them reached for the next file. Neither of them needed to. Not yet.
This story started with a simple question. What happens when the person who annoys you the most is also the one who sees you the clearest? Hermione didn't go looking for Draco. She went looking for distraction, for something that would keep her hands busy while her heart was figuring things out. And Draco, he didn't plan any of this either. He just made tea for two every morning without being asked. That's the thing about real connection. They don't announce themselves. They just quietly show up again and again until one day you realize this person has become necessary. I wanted this story to feel slow because healing is slow, because trust is slow, because the best things don't rush. Hermione is strong, but even strong people need someone who doesn't ask them to be soft, someone who just sees them as they are. And Draco carries so much quietly without asking for credit. That kind of person is rare. I think that why so many people love this pairing. Not because it's easy, but because it earned it. Every argument, every memo, every cup of tea. It all counted. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope it gives you something warm to carry today.